Welcome to this lecture on supply chains in a VUCA world. And I think when I look at this artifact, the one I was wearing before we started this lecture, I wonder what we will think in the future about looking at pictures that are being taken today, and what our thoughts are, how we will remember this time. Well, we think this is like memories in a Time Life book. The times in the life in that world that never was. Okay, let's get started. Supply chains in a VUCA world. VUCA. I don't know how you're feeling about this one, but I thought this quote was quite appropriate. There are decades where nothing happens and weeks where decades happen. And I have too many examples when I think about many of the courses that I teach today and the material that I'm trying to bring across to the students. I have the feeling that anything I was teaching prior to the middle of March was bunk, that it no longer applies, and I almost have to take experiences that are coming straight out of the newspaper today or out of the internet. And let me give you another example of that. Something that came up yesterday. It was almost one of those things, if you didn't think it was possible, and it was in your wildest imagination, it's probably true. West Texas crude oil yesterday was sold for minus $37. What does that actually mean? That means that the people who are actually producing the West Texas crude were paying for you to take their oil. So how come that can actually come to play? They had no place to put it. So if we look at the whole concept of supply and demand, we've gotten to the point with regards to the oil industry that they keep pumping the oil. Nobody needs it because everybody's in lockdown mode, and they have no other place to put it. It's recovered a little bit, as you can see. The U.S. oil prices briefly climbed back above zero on Tuesday, going from minus 37 to zero, before dropping back into negative territory. That means even today, and this was taken straight out of the internet today, you are getting paid to actually take West Texas crude oil. For somebody who actually went through the oil shock in 1973, that seems unfathomable. So what does this actually mean? Let's look at this term VUCA. First of all, I'd like to go ahead and explain it to you. I will also give you a brief explanation of what a supply chain is about. And let's look at how these components actually change through time. VUCA stands for volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. And it actually it's a term that was created by the U.S. military to describe situations that they were coming up with for the first time. The fact is that some things are VUCA and some things aren't. And I'd like to go ahead and talk about the difference between both of them. But before I do that, let me go ahead and explain to you a simple theory that is very important for us today, and it's called power law. And within power law, and there are various ways of actually looking at power law, from this definition I'd like to go ahead and give you, freak events have the highest impact because we as human beings have a bias. We think if it doesn't happen very often, it couldn't be that bad. We know a little bit better now, considering our current situation, but let me give you some examples of where this actually comes into place. Before I do that, let me go ahead and paint a scenario where we're able to go ahead and understand that a lot of these things that we consider to be freak events that really don't never happen, they happen more often than you realize. The first one I'd like to go ahead and get started with is an event that took place on the 15th of April, 1816. It was a volcano in Tambora, the Tambora volcano in Indonesia. Within this eruption that took place in 1816, it was so powerful that here in Europe we had snow in June, freezing temperatures in July, a killer frost in August, the most gloomy and extraordinary weather ever seen. And that went on for a time way past the summer. And so when we think this could never happen, the fact is it already did happen. So how can we go ahead and claim that this is new or that could never happen to us? This was the whole thing about bias. Is this a freak event? Sure. Do we say that a freak event like this has an impact? I think you can answer the question yourself, right? So let's move on. Now I'm going to come up with a couple of different examples, so some things that you might not necessarily think of as being VUCA events. And of course, if we were to look at the current situation, and the one that we're using as a benchmark very often today, is looking at the Spanish flu of 1918, where apparently a number of 50 million were killed. That is a misnomer that it was called the Spanish flu because it actually was initiated in the United States. And of course the attitude that they had was a little bit different. Obviously the means by which they could actually go ahead and counteract the Spanish flu were not nearly the same as what we have today. There was a war going on at the time, and we saw within the Spanish flu, the first round wasn't as bad as the second round. Now, maybe for those of you who are wondering how soon can we actually go ahead and go back outside and get the economy up and running, that might be food for thought. But let's go ahead and continue with this idea of VUCA moments. Now, you might not necessarily consider this one to be a VUCA moment. I do, because I never thought it would ever happen. The fall of the Berlin Wall on the 9th of November, 1989. And of course, the actual event per se, the fall of the wall, was not as powerful as those things that happened before it. And of course, those things that happened after. The actual fall of the wall was a milestone, a tipping point, but of course, the effect that it had was huge. Let's continue. Here's another event we thought, especially in the United States, this could never happen to us. Ground Zero, the 11th of September, 2001. And of course, you're familiar, I'm sure, with all these pictures. And we know the effect that had, and let's go ahead and concentrate on the subject matter, that being supply chain. What effect did this one have on supply chains? Well, of course, there was no air traffic directly following the 11th of September, meaning that there was no way of actually moving goods around. There was a pure paranoia that was taking place, at least for a week afterwards, I remember. And of course, the repercussions of that, of what took place on this day, we're still feeling today. Sorry, I didn't talk about the immigration ban that President Trump just passed through yesterday evening. Here's another one for you. The Indian Ocean earthquake and tsunami on the 26th of December 2004. Here was a case of where an earthquake took place. Because the earthquake was so strong, it caused a huge tsunami that affected the entire area. Again, let's go ahead and concentrate on the subject matter, that being supply chains. The effect that this one had on a number of countries was huge, and it took a long time for those countries to actually go ahead and get past those inadequacies caused by the tsunami, primarily the tsunami. You might remember this one too. Lehman Goes bankrupt. It was another one where it's not as if we couldn't imagine that we would have a financial crisis, but we could not truly envision the effect that something that was so minuscule, again another tipping point, had. And of course the supply chains were directly affected by the amount of capital that was no longer at our disposal. And we saw the valuation or the wealth of a number of individuals just collapsed. The Dow went down to the Dow Jones Industrial Average, which is a stock market host of the United States, where you have the 30 strongest industrial companies, or so they've been listed, got as low as 6,500, I remember. Of course, it's looking a little bit different today. But of course, the effects that these VUCA experiences have are huge in that of what we're trying to do. Let's continue, shall we? Here is one where I think we could never imagine the effect that the supply chains would have from this one event. This was in March of 2011, an earthquake in Japan, where again the effects came primarily from not just the earthquake, but the tsunami that took place. And here you see the destruction. The earthquake itself was a 9.1. And of course, we all know about Fukushima. Fukushima is a great case of power law because they built Fukushima assuming that we would never have an earthquake higher than 9, I believe, or maybe even less. I don't remember exactly the figure, but it doesn't matter. It was 9.1. And we know that when we're talking about a Richter scale, this is exponential, meaning that a 9.1 is that much stronger. It's double what the actual 9 would be. And so the effect was devastating. Again, power law, freak event that we think that will never happen to us, so we never prepare for it. And that is really the message of this lecture. And of course, now we are in the coronavirus crisis, COVID-19. And here's a quote from Mark Anderson, who was the creator of the Mosaic browser and runs a VC company today. Quote from him, an article that just came out titled, "It's Time to Build." As I write this, New York City has put out a desperate call for rain ponchos to be used as medical gowns. Rain ponchos in 2020 in America, in the so-called richest country in the world, that they would actually revert to rain ponchos to actually give to the medical staff as a solution so they can actually go ahead and work on patients that are afflicted with COVID-19. One has to wonder, now were they also afflicted by power law? And here's a great example of where the demand was there, the supply was not to be found, or perhaps we had issues tied to the logistics. So when I refer to the concept of supply chains, let me just give you a brief overview of what we're actually talking about. And the best way for me to actually go ahead and depict that to you would be the SCORE model, where we actually go ahead and come up with our resources, we perform the procurement, we produce the goods, and then we go ahead and deliver them. So we have the procurement, we have the production, and then the actual logistics. Let's assume that we are trying to be circularly oriented, so we would actually go ahead and return them to the source. But this lecture won't be about that. That would take too much time for us today. But the real issue is one, where do we come up with the face masks and the gowns that are required by the hospitals to actually go ahead and take care of the patients. The actual production per se is not taking place here, so we have to get them from somewhere else. Furthermore, we might not even have the necessary knowledge to go ahead and create it, or we might not have the facilities to go ahead and create it. There are all kinds of problems that we're running across here. And don't even talk about logistics, because we didn't even get to that part. Once we're able to go ahead and find them, we usually come up with a way to solve the logistics problem. So this is really what we're talking about here, where we're actually coming up with the material, where the production's taking place, and then lastly, where we actually go ahead and move it from A to B. There are all kinds of problems along this line. So let's go ahead and take a look at our current situation with COVID, where there is a huge demand. There is not much of a supply. And of course, because we've created the situation, there will be a point where we would not even be able to afford the materials because of this downward spiral that we find ourselves in with the economy. So when we're talking about a supply chain, especially within a VUCA world, we're not talking about anything that's circular. Again, let's go back. You could envision this model as being circular, but in reality, never really does look that clean. It's looking much more like an ecosystem, which means you have a bunch of different parts, and there's going to be an effect that takes place here, that you're going to feel over here. And depending upon how this flow goes, either you will be able to solve your issue or at least have an idea of where you can actually go ahead and move further, or you can't. One of the biggest issues that I think that we have today, especially looking at our current crisis, is that we think, well, once we have this solved, then we know how to move forward. But the fact is that our model needs correction. We are not ready for a VUCA world. And in my point is that the next time something like this happens, and as I showed you earlier, VUCA events, or what we consider VUCA events to be, are happening more and more. Oh, sorry, I didn't talk about 2016. That was clearly a year of VUCA events, ones that I never could have ever imagined would have taken place. So what is actually the problem? On the one hand, we cannot imagine these things taking place. So first off, we need to think that the impossible is always possible. We need to get past our bias. And we need to come up with new models, for sure. So let's go ahead and take a look at something that came out in The Economist this week. And this is all fresh information, because if I was to take anything from last week, very possibly it would have been out of date. All kidding aside, this came from Mark Carney, who used to be the head of the Bank of Canada, and lastly was the head of the Bank of England. And he put together an article for The Economist and was trying to frame the situation today in better understanding how do we move forward. So some of the statements that actually came from the article with Mark Carney, fragmentation of the local economy, and the global economy. And I think that you've probably seen enough comments coming through from our politicians, understanding that we cannot allow for a situation like this to happen again. Okay, what we define as what the situation is and what we consider never again to be, we might have a difference of opinion. But the fact is that these huge global supply chains have shown not to be necessarily as efficient as we thought they were. And in fact, this condition had been seriously put under consideration or under question for a number of years now. And there was another piece that came through again from The Economist where they turned the phrase globalization, and the idea was to move past this global more towards regional or perhaps even local. And I think that we will see a further let's try this again. This is live. A further exploitation of moving in that direction. The second point, or one of the main points that was coming out from the article from Mark Carney, the involvement of the state in the economy. And we hear for the first time for about 40 years this idea of nationalization, that there are certain companies or certain sectors that are in our national interest. And so what does that actually mean? Another point that Carney raised is the balance between risk and resilience. Let me go ahead and explain these two terms for you. Risk, of course, is that by nature is considered to be an unknown event or an unplanned event. So that means we didn't plan it, and there are different ways that we can go ahead and categorize risk. We have, and let's go ahead and go back to one of the famous quotes coming from, almost about 20 years now, from Donald Rumsfeld, who was the Secretary of Defense for George H.W. Bush, and he talked about the unknown unknown. So if we're talking about risks, just because we didn't plan it didn't mean that we couldn't anticipate it. And those are the known unknowns. We just don't know when it's going to take place. And without going into further detail as to all the different permutations, the unknown unknowns are really the VUCA moments that we're talking about. We had no clue that this could happen, and for the most part, how do you prepare yourself for something you cannot imagine coming your way? And the idea from Carney is not just to go ahead and focus on those risks, but how do we bounce back? How do we actually go ahead and create a situation where we're resilient, we're able to go ahead and manage it? And that will be the focus of the last part of my lecture here today, on the idea of supply chains and how we actually go ahead and manage them a little bit better in a VUCA world. And the last part that Carney mentions, and I believe this one, I think his article was really spot on. The lessons from Corona will not be so easily forgotten. I remember when we first went into lockdown, and I was talking to some of my students, they were saying, in a couple months, everything will turn to normal. I raised the question, what is normal? I have serious doubts that what we had before the lockdown will ever be achieved again. And I know that's a very strong statement, and I'm trying to make this as provocative as possible simply because I'm trying to get your attention. The real truth is that it's going to take us a long time to get used to a situation, getting past this lockdown phase, getting past the social distancing phase, trying to better understand how we can go ahead and live in a world where things are not so clear, that we cannot just go ahead and focus on efficiency, and we need to be better prepared. Let's move on. So this is the real issue, folks. Up till now, our complete focus has been on this component. We keep looking at doing things in an efficient way. Carney talks a little bit about this in his article as well. So that means the only thing that we really care about is being more efficient. So what does that actually mean, being more efficient? Efficiency means cheaper, faster, perhaps more manageable with less staff or whatever, certainly from a societal perspective, that things work better. But of course, by thinking things work better, we're making a whole slew of assumptions that we know what better is, which has been a serious problem. And I think that some of you, especially after what you've been going through the last month, would agree with me on that point. The second one would be that if we're not able to go ahead and make adjustments due to a situation, we see the results. I don't go back to those other slides that I showed you, slides from the flip chart. I won't go back to them. I can definitely go ahead and explain what we talked about. Let's go ahead and look at the quote from Mark Anderson. I don't need to tell you about the problems that we have with regards to getting these, I threw it overboard, the face mask. We're talking about problems getting not only the equipment for our hospitals, we're having problems getting cotton swabs. So I question the efficiency of being able to be put in that situation And again, I go back to this concept of power law, a freak event, and the impact that it actually has. So I raise the question for all of you, especially when trying to come up with supply chains, how efficient is that? And I think that's a rhetorical question. You can answer that yourself. So we should always ensure that when we're trying to make sure that things work well, that we have a mechanism built into our models that ensure that we're always doing things in an effective way. So what can that mean, an effective way? Here, first of all, I like to go ahead and talk about closed loops. Now, closed loops means that if we start something, we're able to go ahead and trace the entire path, and that we can bring things back to where we originally started. Now, within processes, you usually have closed loops. Certainly, if we look at the SCORE model from supply chain, that is by nature a closed loop, that those things that are actually produced should be brought back if we have returns or if there are defects by nature, unless there are certain companies that decide that they'll just go ahead and throw it away. But that's, again, a subject for another discussion. If we're not able to go ahead and come up with closed loops, then we don't know what happened. We're not able to go ahead and follow things, and that becomes a serious problem. So the question I pose to you, so how does that actually apply to us, and what can we do? The idea here is when you come up with closed loops, the smaller the area you're trying to cover, the more easily you can come up with a closed loop. I talked earlier about this idea of globalization, a concept that was coming through a couple years ago. We talked about, it was alluded to by Carney in his article, and something that we hear quite often from our politicians, that we need to make sure that we take care of production of things that we consider to be in our national interest. Whether they're able to go ahead and define those things is perhaps something that we can also discuss, but let's leave that point to the side. One thing's for sure, what we are able to go ahead and produce locally, and I would argue the smaller this entity is of what we consider to be local, the better off we are. Because if we know what's actually taking place within our community, where we can actually go ahead and find it, well, then we wouldn't have had a lot of these problems. Now, I know you might be saying that's an ideal world, and we're far from that. Then I would raise the question, okay, if that's an ideal world, would you consider what we have now an ideal world? I don't know about you, I don't consider it to be an ideal world. So can we come up with models that work a little bit better? Number one. Number two, when I say local and when I say closed loops, I am not referring we throw our relationships with others out the window. Quite the opposite. We see the importance of always working in unison with other countries or other regions. And I think that this whole situation with Corona has been a great example of how we could learn from other countries, how they were able to manage it. They were confronted with the situations much earlier than us. So that means they have an idea of how to deal with it, and we should not consider their ideas to be funny because they didn't come from us. So where's the problem here? The problem is the bias. So closed loops means that those things that truly are to be found within a VUCA situation, we can manage them a little bit better because they're within our community. We have a better overview, and we can make sure that they always stay in place. And lastly, one of the points that Carney talked about is value. If things work in our community, wouldn't you consider that to be valuable? I certainly would. And so again, our goal has to be working on closed loops. So far so good? We're almost done. One last point to come up with. We see this one also quite often today. The idea of adaptation. Like talking about two different concepts. Prediction or predictive and adaptive. Now predictive means that we're able to guess how long it will take to get from A to B. or how much we will need in a year's time of goods X, or what our economy is going to be looking like in a year's time. Of course, that's always been an interesting journey. But we run across a situation now, especially with COVID-19, that we don't know how bad it's going to be. We come up with horror scenarios, rightfully so, because if people don't feel it's in their interest, they won't do anything, which is actually a pretty sad state of affairs, but so are we as human beings, and I would never admit that I'm any different. But the key is not expecting that everybody always has the answers, and that we're able to go ahead and change. So here in Austria, it's been very interesting watching how the government approaches it, and I think for the most part they're trying to be very cautious, which we will see at the end of the day whether that was the best model, but that's neither here nor there for this argument. But they take it one step at a time. They understand that we're concentrating on the R naught equation, meaning that the replication of COVID-19 is at least 1-to-1. So one person has the disease, is passing it on to somebody else. Once you could bring that level down below